This really is a transformation in what we can do with large amounts of data.
Hi, and welcome to That Cancer Conversation, the podcast that brings together the science and the stories behind cancer. I'm Sophie from Cancer Research UK. Artificial intelligence is no longer science fiction. It's here and it's becoming part of our everyday lives. With tools like ChatGPT, facial recognition on our phones, and personalised playlists, AI is changing how we live, work, and connect. But what happens when AI steps into the world of healthcare? Could it actually help us beat cancer? To help answer these big questions, I'm joined by Lara Lewington, a leading technology journalist, television presenter, and author of Hacking Humanity, a book all about AI and the future of our health. Lara, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining me. You've been a technology presenter and journalist for quite some time. When did you first hear about AI?
Oh, goodness. I've been talking about AI since long before it was fashionable and since long before anyone wanted to hear about it. But AI has been around us and being used for a long time now. It's nothing new and it's not just one thing. And I think this was almost a bit of a frustration to me, actually, in 2023, where suddenly the world wanted to talk about it and talk about their fear, especially. I've been discussing it for years and I'd always raised the questions over just because AI can do something, should it? And at that point, this was a very new conversation. But it took the emergence of ChatGPT for everybody to be interested in the many different things that AI can do in its many different forms. So finally, I feel like people want to hear about it, and that's really quite nice.
So, AI has just taken a life of its own in recent years. How has it impacted healthcare in particular?
So many different ways, whether it's an extra pair of eyes looking at a scan trying to spot tumours, or it's helping a doctor take notes so they can have the more human experience, or maybe it's analysing micro movements in the face and gaze pattern to quantify depression, which it can do in a way that no human ever could. There are so many possibilities because it's all about patterns. AI can spot patterns that no human ever could, and this means that the power is just incredible.
I mean, there's so much that could happen, and there's so much power within AI, like you've said, and analysing big data. And at Cancer Research UK, we're all about trying to use that data to prevent cancer, detect it better, make better treatments. How do you see AI shaping cancer research?
Yeah, cancer is an area with so many variables, and this is why there is such promise from what AI can do. There's the genetics of the tumour, the location of the tumour, the stage of the cancer, the genetics of the patient, even their microbiome, so much that it makes a difference throughout the process of understanding risk, who we're going to screen when, and then when it comes to diagnosis and treatment, personalising what can happen. And within cancer, there definitely seems to be the most power for change because there are so many different elements being drawn into that data to unearth findings. But there are also other more complex things like recurrence risk. And when people are making a decision on what treatment they're going to have to prevent recurrence, anything that can add to the information, to the statistical chance of that recurrence happening is really useful. There was a trial that I filmed with in breast cancer patients in Paris where they were doing just this, and they were trying to help guide people. It was only a trial, so they weren't actually giving the results to the patient, but they're working on a system to be able to help people better understand that recurrence risk. If there's a very high chance of recurrence, then of course people are more likely to want to see through full treatment, but you've got to accept the side effects that are going to come with it, and that can be really hard. And if there's a very low risk, on balance, people may decide to not go through the treatment. But the AI is allowing far more nuanced detail to go into that to really understand, because it's those people who sit somewhere in the middle of that recurrence risk that it's really difficult for. But also there's understanding not just who is at risk of what cancer, and genetics play a huge part in this, as we know, and Genomics England are doing some research into the idea of not just who is likely to get it, but when. Why are so many younger people getting cancer? And how can we predict what seem like the anomalies right now? Because it's all about prediction and therefore prevention, or at least finding earlier and better ways of treating.
And we often talk about how cancer is a really complex disease. It's super complex. And do you think AI is going to help break down some of that complexity for us?
Well, I think it can. Look, it's important to recognise that this isn't all going to be perfect and it's not going to happen overnight. And I think possibly the most heartbreaking part of covering this, a great story of hope, is it's not going to be soon enough for everybody. And it also needs to be discussed in ways that are sensitive to people who are living with chronic cancer, people who've just lost someone to cancer, people who fear cancer based on what may have happened to their parents or grandparents. And there are so many human elements to this. And it is, as you say, so complicated. AI is going to allow us to unearth findings where we start to see patterns that have never been spotted before. And as time passes, we'll understand more about genetic risk. Some of the cancers that we don't know have that, we'll eventually understand do. We'll understand more about the target when it comes to AI drug discovery, when it comes to personalising medicine. And if we can hit the tumour harder and hurt the patient less, that will be incredible progress. Because as many oncologists said to me, killing cancer isn't hard. Killing cancer in a way that's tolerable to the patient is the real challenge.
And there's that factor of really thinking about quality of life.
You've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. We have a great issue with health span right now. Life expectancy has doubled since 1900, but health span in England, a high-income country with a National Health Service, leaves women spending a quarter of their lives in what's considered poor health, and men a fifth. Cancer treatment can be part of that poor health span. Also, having cancer obviously can be. There are so many things that play into that. But closing this gap on health span and lifespan, trying to avoid spending years or decades in drawn-out painful decline, is a really valuable target here. It's not just about asking the AI to keep us alive, but to keep us alive in a state that we want to be. And quality of life data is being pulled into more research into cancer treatments than it ever has been before. This is really, really important, and we talk a lot about survival rates, but there's a huge amount of suffering that happens in that process.
AI is kind of really pushing us towards that personalised medicine that we've all been talking about for quite a while. Is it going to make personalised medicine more accessible and cheaper?
I think it can. And this is going to be one of the big challenges. I spoke to an oncologist in the US who was actually Steve Jobs' doctor, and he talked to me about the drugs that he uses off-label. So these are drugs that are approved for use, but he's using them for something different to what they're approved for use for. And he can personalise just the right treatment for somebody who can afford to have that level of treatment. Obviously, what we want the AI to be able to do at a broader level is to be able to personalise at a cost that is affordable to healthcare systems for everybody. And in the UK, where we have a single payer system, a national health service, we should be able to do this. Now, we have enormous challenges right now in our healthcare, and prevention may be cheaper than cure. It doesn't make it easy to enforce. But many people talk about this idea of turning it from a system of sick care to healthcare. There are great hopes as to what we can do, but we need to understand what's scalable and what's affordable. And actually, the fact you can do a lot computationally rather than within the realms of trial and error on people through trials, and actually understand what is more likely to work for someone should hopefully make this work economically as well as in terms of kindness. And I think it's always quite difficult for people to stomach the idea of the economics, but we know that that exists and that's the reality. And we can only work within the bounds of what's possible.
Absolutely. And I guess with AI, as much as there's a lot of hope around it and excitement around it, there's also a lot of fear that's also around it. You know, people talking about how AI might take our jobs or replace our doctors. How true is that?
Fear makes headlines, but there is also some reality here, of course. I just think that people don't necessarily always worry about the thing they should be worrying about. Big problem right now, disinformation, knowing what to believe, where we're going with trust, where there's data showing that by 2030, it's something like 50 to 90% of the internet, depending who you ask, could be AI slop. If we're reading an internet generated by AI, how do we even know what's real? If it's referencing medical papers, how do we even know that medical paper's real? And all of this is a very real issue, as is bias, although we must also acknowledge the fact that AI gives us the opportunity to correct the biases that have existed. So it's all about doing things right and training the AI in the onset to set out on the right path. There are issues over cyber war. There are issues over becoming too reliant on data and a world online. And you only have to see what happens in the odd news story where something goes down and everything comes to a standstill that is running on that system. So There are risks, but there's also incredible benefit to be had. And I don't feel that the benefits of AI are discussed enough, because there is the power to democratise education, healthcare, to do a lot for our environment. We often hear, well, AI uses a lot of power, that's going to be very damaging. And there's huge debate going on in this area, that's another conversation. But there's also the possibility to fix some of the greatest problems that the world has right now. And it's very easy to jump to an idea of fear of something that we don't necessarily fully understand. We don't know how it reaches the conclusion it does. There's the black box problem. We know the input and the output, what's happening in between. But actually, there's incredible possibility and hope, especially when it comes to health and especially when it comes to cancer. And that's why I wrote this book.
And you've also done a lot of research around AI ethics as well. I think it's an area that a lot of people are still unsure on where it's heading. And also the big question is, who is in charge of all of that data? You know, who are we giving all this data to?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that question. First of all, the question of ethics. People have different cultural expectations as well. So I don't think there are uniform rules in some areas that we're going to be able to stick to. But there are general theories of not hurting people which would exist everywhere. But our feelings about what AI decides and our response to that are something very complex, and I think something that we as humans will evolve and change our opinion on. So let's take, for example, self-driving cars. So if they can drive around, causing far fewer accidents, then you'd think, great, result. But the reality is, they may cause fewer accidents and fewer deaths, but those that they do cause will be ones that no human ever would have done, because they will be very weird. And so how we feel about those, the instant human response being, well, wouldn't have happened if a human driver had been there. And that person doesn't have to live with what they've done for the rest of their lives. There's no person involved in it. And there are these complexities surrounding it that are actually very different from whether the AI is doing a better or worse job. So as all this evolves, which it inevitably will, our opinions, our beliefs and our expectations, I believe, will change. And that may sound wacky and silly now, but look at how life has changed due to smartphones. We've adapted as well. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, on data, well, we need to make peace with the data that we're handing over and understand what it's for. There's definitely a greater enthusiasm from people to hand over, and this comes from the data, to hand over other data, to hand over their data to the NHS than there is to a tech company. And it's not just a matter of trust. It's also the fact that people don't necessarily feel happy that a tech company might benefit from their data, even if they're benefiting as well.
Do you think there's a trust issue with humans and AI?
I think there's a trust issue with both. I think people have trust issues with humans. You take an instant like or a dislike to them and it could be an issue. That's a thing that exists. There's definitely a trust issue with AI as well, often to the black box theory I mentioned earlier. The idea that you know what data's going in and what comes out, how does it reach that conclusion? Medics need to understand how it's reaching that conclusion when it's used in health. And yes, people do have issues with trust over machines and people. And they always will do.
Do you think it's getting better as we keep talking more about AI now than, say, when it first started?
Possibly. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no, actually. I think the fear still exists. But that question over fear definitely exists and is the forefront of people's mind. And it's largely because they don't know the inner workings of the AI. And we want to know that the AI has good intentions. And not just that it has good intentions, but that it has sensible intentions. The paperclip problem has always been very famous. The idea of you ask an AI to create as many paperclips as it can, and without being told, well, maybe it would use up the world's resources to create every paperclip possible. Well, any human knows that's not what you meant. It's within the realms of what's sensible. And so we're going to go through a lot of obstacles and a lot of headlines showing AI's failings.
And in terms of, looking at the future of where AI is going, what's something that excites you and what's something that worries you about that future?
The ability to better be able to predict disease, know what we're looking for earlier and be able to find conditions sooner is very exciting. But the risk, and the thing that you could say is the worry, is that some people are going to become very anxious because of this. For many people, it's incredibly useful. If you're going to find out you're likely to die at 50 and there's something you can do about it, you want to know. If there's nothing you can do about it, you probably wouldn't. But some people simply don't want a lot of information on themselves. So it's people becoming too anxious in a counterproductive way. And if that stops them from sleeping, that's not good for their health. If it makes them more stressed, that's not good for their health. So it's finding the balance in that.
And do you think AI can help us beat cancer?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think it has the power to be able to, throughout the whole series of what happens in cancer, to recognise who is at risk, to help us screen better. That screening will get better. The liquid biopsy blood test will get better. They will be given to more high-risk groups, because you've got to look at a cost balance here going on as well. And you've got to look at what's realistic for people to feel compelled to do. So we will screen more people at the right moment. More cancers can be found earlier. Treatment can become more personalised. I don't believe it's going to be perfect. I don't believe this is solving cancer entirely. But I think it looks as though, from all the research I've done, we are heading to a far better place.
Wow. I mean, that's going to be huge.
Yeah.
So we also asked on our socials to our listeners if they had any questions about AI and cancer, and we had a few submissions.
Great.
So wondering if you could quickly answer them for us. So Izzy asked, can AI be used to help visualize or explain how cancer research works in a simpler way?
Oh, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I've seen some amazing visualizations in augmented reality, virtual reality, where ahead of surgery, people have been able to see what's going to be done to them. There was a lady who had her aneurysm treated, so brain surgery, a couple of months ago, and she had looked in this augmented reality device at her aneurysm. She could walk around it in the room. It was made absolutely huge, so she could see exactly what was going to be done and fully understand what was going on, why it was important it was treated, and what her recovery would be like. And the doctor could then also have a rehearsal of the surgery, not just on any virtual brain, but her virtual brain. So the power for visualization using technology is incredible. So maybe in terms of cancer, it can help illustrate in a more immersive way to somebody what's going on in their bodies and how that will hopefully be treated.
And maybe that makes it less scarier for a lot of people to see what that looks like.
Yeah.
And understand the process of it all.
Well, that's what I saw with Marie, this lady. I also followed a family through their journey of operating on their 6-month-old baby, and they'd seen in virtual reality what the outcome of the surgery would be. And it was a very difficult decision for them whether they were going to go ahead with the surgery or not. And the power to create these visualizations, and in that, the AI was used to predict what the outcome would be. And AI can do this to predict what's going to happen and also personalise it. And so if somebody is feeling anxious, maybe to illustrate for them exactly what's going on and how it can be solved.
Fantastic. Patrick asked, what extent might AI be helpful in analysing the huge amounts of data relating to cancer, research outcomes, and even predicting appropriate future research?
It can pull in the amount of data that no human or previous computer program could. This really is a transformation in what we can do with large amounts of data. And whether it's AI drug discovery, where you're able to test absolutely loads of drugs computationally before you've got the expense of doing it in a lab. And AI drug discovery is hard. Somebody described it to me once as it's not finding a needle in a haystack, it's finding a needle in a field. So this isn't making it easy, but it's making it easier and it's making it more likely to be able to solve something.
And then finally, we have a question from Alex. And he asks, how will we be able to trust images and if they're real or not? So I guess we touched on this really about, is this paper real or not, or is it all AI generated?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. There was a time when you could question a photograph because it had 6 fingers and the gravity seemed a bit wrong. Obviously, it was always going to get better quickly. And now we can generate video immediately on anything that you want to, and through just a few seconds of your voice, we can have you saying anything. So trust is a real issue, and that's where we're going to start to really need to focus on the sources of where things are coming from and really check that the sources haven't been cheated. A bit like we look for scam emails now, and you think, that seems a bit amiss, am I really due that tax money back? Then you click on checking it's really sent to your email address and that it's really from the Inland Revenue, or whoever in this case the email will be from, that it's genuinely from, and then you go and look independently and check it. But of course the issue with this is, if you're reading what you believe to be the news in the morning, you're not going to go and carry out a research mission on all of it. So this is a huge challenge, and there's various ideas of watermarking anything generated by AI, but obviously bad actors are not going to follow the rules. So this becomes a very new challenge that we all need to become resilient to deal with.
Amazing. Well, Lara, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and sharing all your knowledge. One really interesting way AI is being used in healthcare is through digital twins. Imagine a world where your doctor could test a treatment on a digital version of you before you ever take a pill or change your routine. That's the idea behind digital twins, a virtual you, helping to make real-life healthcare smarter and safer. I'm joined by Professor Peter Coveney from University College London, who's leading a project creating digital twins for healthcare. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me. So what exactly are digital twins, and where did they first come about?
Well, the concept of digital twins is at least 20 years old, and it originates more in engineering than in any other discipline. It's about trying to get blueprints for the design of buildings, it could be spacecraft, bridges, and so on, which are going to be important to have particular resilience and safety aspects that you must try and design into them before you put them into a construction component. So the digital version of a bridge is the thing you first assemble. And actually for the Elizabeth line in London, that was also essentially designed by a digital twin initially, a computer simulation of that line, and then gradually implementing it in a physical manifestation. You may want to know how that develops into the biological context, and that's what followed in more recent times as a result of the increasing access to data, digitized data on biological specimens, and here we mean humans in general. We begin to have the opportunity to create a digital representation of a human or some part of a human and then compare it with the real thing. And it's the interplay between those two to try and get a virtuous circle developing between them that can lead to predictions that you can make on computers. We often say in silico, meaning in computers, that can then be used ahead of taking an action for a particular patient. And it's ultimately the personalised aspect of that, to build digital twins of everybody themselves, which is at stake here and entirely feasible conceptually.
And how do you start to build a digital version of someone? What kind of data do you need to start building that?
The challenge is that there's an aspiration, namely that we'll see a virtual version of ourselves perhaps come through the door here and replace me, in my case, talking to you. But that's really a long way off. But at least it's an aspiration. The reality is we have to build that virtual human bit by bit by piecing together parts of the human body that we know and understand. Now, physiology and the nature of the human body has many levels to it, and we can go down to the genetic level, the molecules of life, DNA, for instance, that we would like to have full understanding of for each individual. We know every individual has their own DNA, so that's one example where we're going to have to collect that. But then we can move up in terms of the structure of the human body. We might be talking about other molecules and proteins. We're building up representations of human cells. Then there's the organ systems, and eventually the integration of the organ systems gives us a whole human. And so bit by bit, we can put these things together. So for digital twins at the moment, we are using and planning to use these components as, for example, to deal with disease cases, of which cancer is clearly an important illustration. And in the long term, integrating them so that we will eventually have a holistic model of the human body, which will start to allow us to address questions that really medicine has barely looked at previously, because it tends to go down to smaller scales, fragment and isolate, for example, disease cases. In reality, they interact with one another. If we can get a whole human representation, we'll be able to see how those interactions actually affect diseases and how we can cure them.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about that holistic overview of a human body and how those little interactions could lead to disease, including cancer. We know that cancer is quite complex. The human body is quite complex. How does building digital twins start to break down that complexity for us?
So the challenge with cancer is, in the end, as some people would say, it's actually a form of rare disease, by which we're implying that each person almost has their own form of this disease. And if you see that as a realistic issue, you realize you really need to have data on an individual to deal with this, the individual's data. And this is going to be an important point we may tease out in talking about what we mean by AI today. But to come to your question, essentially we need to have a good insight into how the disease works to understand what data is required. So cancer is widely recognized as having a significant genetic component, and the role of mutations is important. So obviously there we need a lot of information on that lower level I mentioned earlier, which is the genomic component. But there are going to be other aspects to the disease. It depends on which cancer case we're looking at, what other information may become important. But broadly speaking, we need to be able to understand some parts of the mechanism of the cancer. And then in a digital twin, remember, we need both the digital representation and how the human involved is responding, so we can bring the model into alignment with the observations. For some disease cases and for some forms of cancer, this is becoming possible already. For others, that virtuous circle we're trying to establish will help us understand the disease better. So there are cases where we might want to solve cancer instantly or other medical problems, but often we need the information that we haven't yet got from a mechanistic perspective to be sure we understand how to treat the patient. So this is an agenda for 21st century medicine as a whole, to make sure we understand the mechanisms of disease and can treat them properly. Importantly, as I said earlier, we need the data on the individual patient or person to be able to make these reliable predictions. This is different from artificial intelligence as it's usually understood, which, if you think about it, is actually getting lots of data on previous patients, say in clinical trials from other sources, and then using their data to predict your health condition. That isn't personalized medicine, actually. It's using other people's data to predict it. So there is a significant gap there which digital twins are aiming to fill.
And it's trying to predict using someone's specific personalized data to make that personalized prediction.
Totally. So in the end, it becomes your own avatar or your virtual me, as it were, that you have and own yourself. In the long term, this is the vision many of us espouse, that people will own their own digital twin, because the question of data and ownership is always a tricky one to deal with information governance. Here we're imagining a future where you own your own data. Where do you put it? You put it in the equivalent of a bank account. Today, most people are quite well satisfied with this level of security in their bank accounts. Otherwise, we wouldn't do internet banking. And that really is a model that would suit the ownership of data on an individual level. People could then use and access that data and choose which medical experts to share it with. And indeed, we may come on to the use of these data in silico, so virtual clinical trials where people could contribute into a clinical trial using their own avatars.
I mean, it sounds quite futuristic, almost, to have this virtual version. So would it almost be like a virtual version of you on your phone that you could grant access to the GP you're sitting in front of?
It is exactly that kind of thing we're getting at. In order to participate in this future, people do need access to mobile phones, essentially, and that can become a discriminatory issue. In the UK, probably 15% of the population don't own cell phones of any sort. And even today, digital health in the NHS is discriminating against those people because they can't get access to healthcare as it is delivered for most people. So that's a challenge. But beyond that, as you say, if your data is accessible like your bank account, you can choose how to distribute it yourself and get involved in things like clinical trials I mentioned, or consulting health experts. It's a very different model from the current one, which is AI driven, where we try to aggregate everyone's data, and that becomes susceptible to a lot of things like data breaches, security breaches, who's got hold of our data, because everyone's is put together in order to do these, I'm going to predict your health on the basis of other people's data. This would really turn the whole game around. It's some distance away in general, but it's happening for particular cases already.
And how does having digital twins start to help us tackle things like cancer? What sort of things could they help with?
So there are many answers to that question. I can give you one to kick off with, which is related to the use of drugs. Which drug should I give which patient? But when you come down to diseases like cancer, the percentage of the population for which any drug works is far less than 50%. It's typically, it could be down to 3 or 4%. It might be 10 or 15. So it's immediately much harder to justify the personalized nature of those drugs from a pharma perspective. But that's the kind of thing we need to be able to develop. And it means finding drugs that, if not working for a given individual, at least some stratum of the population which will respond positively to that drug. To design a drug like that requires us to know the genomic composition of the patient and to be able to understand how targets, which are usually proteins derived from the DNA that the patients have, will respond to particular drugs. So you immediately then have this perspective where drugs work for different people. And that's what we're getting at. We need that aspect to deal with different people's cancers. That's just in the area of the molecular end of the disease. But then if we start talking about up to the whole human, you can worry about the cells, the pathways through which the disease can propagate. And if you understand enough about those pathways, again, you can target some of the proteins in those pathways and try to block them with specific drugs. But again, it's going to be relevant to a subset of the population. And so it goes on as you go higher up and into the interesting areas which current medicine in the Western world doesn't really look at, which is where there may be cross interactions between different disease cases, where you can only see that if you have interactions between different parts of the human body. And that's what we will end up achieving with digital twins that are faithful representations of the whole body.
So in practice, how would a digital twin work for a disease like cancer?
A patient would go in to see the doctor. They would have the data that's relevant here. From what we said earlier, it's likely to be genomic data in particular. With that information and understanding of what's going on in the cancer case, the doctor should be able to find a match to that patient of a molecule that will block the effective nature of cancer taking shape in the human body. They would make that decision there and then we would hope the patient would move on with a successful treatment.
And would that treatment also be tested on the digital twin?
That's the basis of this. It would be put into the digital twin to check that it fits the bill, and if the thumbs are up from the virtual digital twin, they would move forward with it. Yes.
Amazing. So do you think digital twins have the potential to replace doctors in the future?
The short answer to that is no, not in the near future. We will need the expertise and insights and decision-making capabilities of doctors to override some of the options that come from digital twins.
Peter, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
You are welcome.
Fascinating. Thanks for watching this episode of That Cancer Conversation. If you're enjoying the show, you can give us a like and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. All of this episode's resources are in the description box below. And for more cancer stories, you can visit our website, Cancer News. Also, if you have a question you'd like to ask us, you can comment below or email podcast@cancer.org.uk.